As you saw yesterday, Dan, when I was introduced to your wife, I said, I'm glad to meet you, Mrs. Cartwright.
Picture this. America is gathered around the TV, the Ponderosa, glowing in living rooms like a warm fireplace, and there he is, Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant, the man whose smile could calm any a storm, whose laughter felt like it could lift the roof right off the ranch house. For years, fans believed they knew him, but what most people never realized is that behind that lovable warmth, Dan Blocker, the man who played Hoss, carried a life filled with shocking twists, quiet burdens, and secrets he kept locked away from the public eye. And now, decades later, at 66 years old, one of Dan Blocker's sons has finally stepped forward to confirm something that's been whispered about for years. A truth that could change how many fans remember Dan Blocker and his legacy. But before we get to that moment, before we touch the revelation itself, we have to rewind all the way back. Because when you understand where Dan came from, you start to see why his life was never as simple as the character he played. Dan Blocker's story begins with a bang, literally. He was born Bobby Dan Davis Blocker on December 10th, 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas. And from the very first moment, he was already breaking expectations. He entered the world weighing an incredible 14 pounds. 14. People talked about it like it was folklore, like the town had witnessed something impossible. Before he could even walk, he was already a legend. He grew up in the tiny community of O'Donnell, Texas, where life was simple and work came early. Dan spent his childhood helping at his family's grocery store, hauling heavy bags for customers, learning the value of kindness, patience, and plain old hard work. Those early years shaped him. They built the humble, down-to-earth man the world would eventually fall in love with. A gentle soul. A man whose laugh filled a room. A heart that always seemed too big for Hollywood. And the thing is, even as a kid, Dan wasn't living a normal childhood. By the time he was 10 years old, he wasn't just playing games and riding bikes. He was working shoulder to shoulder with grown men, hauling grain, lifting lumber, sweating on construction sites like he belonged there. His strength wasn't some cute little story people told later. It was real. It was obvious. It was the kind of a strength that made people stare. The folks in town even gave him a nickname that stuck. The Big, because what else could they call a kid like that? By the age of 12, Dan was already 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, a full-grown man trapped in a kid's life. Some local tough guys tried to test him, tried to see if that size was just for show, but no one walked away with a win. Dan never lost a fight, not because he enjoyed hurting people, but because when you grow up that big, the world tends to challenge you just to prove it can. After high school, Dan went to the Texas Military Institute, and with his size and raw athletic power, he was a monster on the football field. It didn't take long for people outside his town to notice. His talent earned him a football scholarship to Sul Ross State University. By then, he stood around 6'4" and weighed about 275 pounds, the kind of presence you couldn't ignore even if you tried. Everyone assumed he was headed for the pros, but fate had a different plan waiting for him, and it started with something that sounds almost too small to matter. One day, the college drama club needed a strong hand to move heavy props. Naturally, they called the biggest guy around. Dan showed up to help, probably thinking it would take a few minutes and then he'd be back to his real life. But that favor changed everything. One night, the club needed an extra body on stage for a play, Arsenic and Old Lace. Dan stepped in, just filling a spot, just doing a favor again. And then something unexpected happened. The crowd loved him, not because he was trained, not because he was polished, but because there was something natural in him, something alive, something honest. That first taste of acting hit him deep, like a spark catching fire in a place he didn't even know existed. Soon enough, Dan made a decision that stunned people around him. He dropped his English major and switched to theater. He chose the thrill of the stage over the roar of the stadium. And even when real offers came in to play professional football, he turned them down. Imagine that. A man built like a tank offered a future in pro sports, and he walks away because he found something that felt more true. His dream pulled him all the way to New York City, where he ended up on the Broadway stage in a production of King Lear. And that was the moment the road to Hollywood really began. But just when Dan thought his path was finally set, life threw him a wild curveball, the kind that tests not just your strength, but your soul. After finishing college, Dan Blocker traded his textbooks for an army uniform. He was ready to serve his country and face the unknown. And stepping into military life wasn't easy, especially not for a man built like him. He stood over 6'3" and weighed close to 300 pounds. The army wasn't ready for him. It took nearly a whole month just to find boots big enough to fit his massive feet. Think about that. Before he even stepped into battle, the world was already telling him, you don't fit. But once he was geared up, there was no turning back. Dan was sent into one of the toughest conflicts of his generation, the Korean War. By Christmas of 1951, he was on the front lines near Chorwon, North Korea, serving as a combat infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment. Out there, it wasn't about fame. It wasn't about applause. It was about survival. The wind cut like knives. The nights dragged on without sleep. Gunfire echoed through the hills over and over like the world had forgotten how to be quiet. Yet through it all, Dan stood tall, leading his men, pushing forward, proving his strength wasn't just muscle. It was something deeper, something unbreakable. For nearly 7 months, he fought through brutal trench warfare, mud, explosions, chaos everywhere, and then came one night that would define him. In the middle of heavy gunfire, Dan saw one of his fellow soldiers trapped and bleeding, unable to move. And without hesitation, without calculating the risk, he charged straight into the firestorm and dragged his comrade to safety while bullets tore through the air. That moment left him wounded, but it earned him the Purple Heart, a medal for bravery that he wore with quiet pride for the rest of his life. Long before Hollywood ever knew his name, Dan Blocker had already proven he was a hero. And the battles on Pork Chop Hill, some of the most brutal clashes of the Korean War, carved something into him that never fully faded. After months of nonstop fighting, his body reached its limit. He was evacuated from the front lines, battered and bruised, carrying wounds that went far deeper than a skin. When he returned home, he wasn't the same man who had left Texas. The horrors of war didn't make him bitter. They made him certain. He had seen the true cost of violence, and he couldn't stay silent about it. Dan became a voice against unnecessary wars and military aggression, speaking out for peace and compassion. He especially condemned the use of napalm, a weapon whose destruction he had witnessed. For him, peace wasn't just an idea, it was a promise. But fate still wasn't finished with him. After returning to civilian life, Dan was ready for something brighter, love, family, a new purpose. He married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Parker, and together they built a life filled with warmth, raising 4 children in a home that became his anchor after years of chaos. And even though acting hadn't been part of his original plan, destiny had one more twist waiting. While pursuing his doctorate at UCLA, Dan's massive frame, booming voice, and effortless Southern charm caught the attention of Hollywood casting directors. And just like that, the towering Texan who survived war was about to step into a brand new kind of spotlight. Hollywood in the late 1950s was obsessed with one thing: Westerns. Dusty roads, hard men, big guns, and bigger reputations. It was the golden age of television, and if you could ride a horse, throw a punch, or look believable in a hat, the doors could open fast. Dan Blocker didn't come to town as some polished, hungry showbiz climber. He came as a man with a family, a soldier's scars, and a quiet confidence that didn't beg for attention. And yet the camera found him anyway. He started picking up small roles, the kind most actors take just to survive, just to be seen. But even in those early appearances, people noticed something different. Dan didn't act like everyone else. He felt real, like someone you'd actually meet, like someone you'd trust. Through the 1950s, he worked non-stop, stacking experience one job at a time. He appeared in westerns like The Rifleman, Have Gun, Will Travel, and Maverick. And role by role, line by line, he was building a reputation without even trying. Not as a leading man, not as some pretty Hollywood face, but as something rarer, a presence, a heart. And then the call came. The moment every actor prays for and fears at the same time. Bonanza. When Dan Blocker landed the role of Hoss Cartwright, it wasn't just a career move, it was destiny finding the right body, the right voice, the right soul. Hoss wasn't supposed to be the sharpest or slickest member of the Cartwright family. He didn't need to be, because what Hoss brought was something audiences didn't realize they were starving for: warmth. Hoss was the one who could make you laugh in the middle of danger, the one who could stand between cruelty and the people who couldn't protect themselves, the one who felt like a safe place in a world that often wasn't safe. And here's what made it even more powerful. For Dan, Hoss wasn't just a character on a page. It was personal, because the values you saw on the screen weren't invented in a writer's room. Dan carried them. He lived them. He had survived the brutality of war. He understood what violence does to the human spirit. So when he played kindness, it wasn't fake sweetness. It was a choice, a message, a quiet kind of rebellion. People assumed Dan was just the big guy, the lovable giant, the easygoing, a slow-talking teddy bear of the cast. But off camera, Dan was sharp, thoughtful, well-read. He held a master's degree in theater. He loved philosophy. He cared deeply about what kind of man he was becoming and what kind of world his children would grow up in. And that depth shaped the set of Bonanza in ways most fans never saw. Dan formed a real bond with his co-stars, especially Lorne Greene and Michael Landon. Their friendship wasn't just professional chemistry. It was the kind of brotherhood that grows when people spend long days together, season after season, carrying the weight of a hit show. On screen, they were the Cartwright family. Off screen, there was truth behind the act, but fame has a way of changing the air around you. Bonanza wasn't just successful, it became a cultural machine. Dan Blocker became a household name. His face became comfort. His character became a symbol. And suddenly, the man who once hauled grain and worked construction as a kid couldn't walk through public places without getting surrounded. And Dan didn't let it turn him cold. If anything, it made him even more protective of the people around him, especially the ones who were overlooked. There's a story that says everything about who Dan really was during the civil rights era when prejudice was still openly practiced. The Bonanza cast was traveling. A hotel refused to accommodate black members of the team, the kind of ugly discrimination that was treated like normal back then. Dan didn't negotiate. He drew a line. He made it clear that if everyone wasn't welcome, then nobody was staying, not as a dramatic stunt, not as publicity, as a principle. The room went quiet, then chaos erupted because people weren't used to a star doing that. People weren't used to a man that big, that famous, planting his feet and saying no. That moment exposed what the camera couldn't fully capture. Behind the warm smile was a man who couldn't tolerate cruelty. And Dan had his own way of explaining it. He wasn't a man looking for fights, but he believed strength meant something only when it was used for protection. If he saw someone strong hurting someone weaker, he wasn't going to stand there and watch. That was Dan. That was Hoss. Same spine, same heart. Of course, there was another side of Dan Blocker that became legendary too. His appetite. People who knew him used to joke that watching Dan eat was like watching an event. Breakfast wasn't breakfast. It was a mountain of food, plates stacked high, enough for 3 men, sometimes more, and he would sit there, smiling, laughing, enjoying every bite like life itself was meant to be tasted fully. Food for Dan wasn't just indulgence, it was joy, it was comfort, it was home. That love even spilled into business when he got involved with a restaurant named after the famous ranch from Bonanza, a place built on generous portions, and that same warm, welcoming feeling people associated with him. But as the seasons went on, the pressure of television life, the constant work, the indulgence, and the stress quietly started to add up. Dan's weight fluctuated. The schedule stayed brutal. The spotlight never stopped. And then, in a move that surprised a lot of people, Dan made a decision that proved he still belonged to himself more than he belonged to Hollywood. In 1970, he packed up his family and left the noise behind, moving to Switzerland. He wanted something most celebrities never get to have: peace, a quieter life, a place where his kids could grow up without cameras hunting them, a place where he could breathe again. People speculated about money, about contracts, about secret reasons. But the truth was simpler. Dan wasn't running from something scandalous. He was running toward calm. And even from across the ocean, his loyalty to Bonanza never wavered. He kept flying back and forth, staying dedicated to the show and to the fans who loved him. But while the world still saw the gentle giant smiling on TV, Dan's health was beginning to whisper warnings in the background. And those whispers were about to become something far more devastating than anyone expected. The scary part about legends is that the world starts believing they're unbreakable. Dan Blocker looked unbreakable. A man built like a wall, a laugh that shook rooms, a presence that made people feel safe. Even when he left Hollywood for the calm hills of Switzerland, even when he flew back and forth across the ocean to keep his promise to Bonanza, fans still imagined him as the same unstoppable, gentle giant. But behind the scenes, something had started to shift. As Bonanza moved deeper into its later seasons, Dan's health began to quietly decline, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, more like a shadow creeping in, slow enough that you could almost pretend it wasn't real until you couldn't. Doctors eventually discovered he had gallstones, something fairly common, something that sounded manageable, the kind of diagnosis people hear and think, okay, we'll take care of it. You'll rest, you'll bounce back. Dan went in for surgery. The operation seemed to go smoothly. At first, everyone believed the worst was behind them. His family and friends finally breathed again. They were relieved. They thought the danger had passed. And then, out of nowhere, everything collapsed. Dan Blocker suffered a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that blocked his lungs. It hit like a lightning strike. There was no long goodbye, no slow preparation, no time for the world to adjust to the idea that this could actually happen. One moment, he was Dan Blocker, the heart of Bonanza, the man who felt too big to ever disappear, and then he was gone. Dan Blocker died at just 43 years old. That number didn't even feel real to people. 43. For someone who had become a symbol of a strength, it felt impossible, like the universe had made a mistake. News of his death sent shockwaves through the cast, the crew, and millions of fans who had grown up with the Cartwright family like it was their own. His co-stars were devastated, especially the ones who had worked beside him for years, because Dan wasn't just another actor on a hit show. He was the steady force. The person who made long filming days feel like family. The one who could break tension with a joke, then turn around and deliver a moment of tenderness so believable it made you forget you were watching television. When the news spread, tributes poured in from every direction. Letters, flowers, messages filled with love and gratitude. People weren't just mourning a character. They were mourning the feeling he gave them, that warmth, that safety, that reminder that kindness could be powerful. And then, almost immediately, a strange rumor began to grow. One of those stories that spreads because it feels perfect in a bizarre way. People started whispering that Dan Blocker had been buried in a piano box, some huge oversized coffin because he was supposedly too large for a regular one. The story moved fast, turning into folklore, then into fact in the minds of people who repeated it long enough. But that wasn't true. Dan Blocker was buried in a traditional casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. No piano box, no oversized crate, just a respectful burial for a man who lived his life with integrity, laughter, and a kind of quiet dignity Hollywood rarely creates. And when you really think about it, the rumor wasn't just about the coffin. It was about the way people saw him. They couldn't accept that someone so large in spirit could have an ordinary ending. But endings don't ask permission. Dan's death didn't just break hearts, it changed Bonanza forever. The show had already been facing challenges, but losing Dan accelerated everything. The Ponderosa didn't feel the same without Hoss. The family dynamic that made the series feel warm and alive suddenly felt incomplete, like someone had removed the center beam from a house and expected it to keep standing. When production geared up for the next season, the mood on set was heavy. There was a hole no rewrite could patch, and the cast understood something painful. You can replace lines. You can't replace a soul. The decision the show made was simple but powerful. Bonanza would acknowledge the loss. They would not pretend Horse never existed. They would let the audience grieve the way the cast was grieving. The tribute episode was written by Michael Landon, who played Little Joe Cartwright. And he didn't write it with cheap drama or forced explanations. He chose something subtler, something more honest. The episode didn't need to show how Hoss died. It didn't need flashy tragedy, because the absence itself carried the weight. The familiar dining room that once echoed with laughter suddenly felt too quiet. The empty space at the table said more than words ever could, and for many people watching, it wasn't just television. It felt like therapy, a shared funeral where millions of viewers mourned together. But the network's choices after that didn't help. NBC eventually moved the show from its long-standing Sunday time slot to Tuesday nights, and without that big heart in the center, the magic was harder to hold on to. The stories were still good. The acting was still as strong, but the warmth that once defined the Cartwright family began to fade. Bonanza kept going, but it struggled to find its footing. The charm, the brotherhood, that sense of balance between strength and tenderness, it wasn't the same. And here's the eerie part. Dan Blocker had once hinted something like this might happen. He reportedly believed continuing the show without him for too many episodes would become too heavy a load for the network to carry. His words turned out to be almost prophetic. Bonanza continued for a time, but the heart of it, the piece fans treasured most, was never fully restored. And for the Blocker family, the pain was even deeper, because behind the fame and the tributes was a simple truth. A wife had lost her husband. 4 children had lost their father. And one of those children would grow up carrying a kind of silence that lasted decades. After Dan Blocker died, the world mourned a legend. But inside the Blocker home, the grief didn't look like newspaper headlines or tribute episodes. It looked like a mother trying to keep 4 children steady when the ground beneath them had collapsed. It looked like birthdays where the chair at the table stayed empty. It looked like quiet moments when laughter felt dangerous, because the second you laughed, you remembered why it didn't feel complete anymore. Dolphia Blocker, Dan's wife, became the center pole of the family overnight. She wasn't married to Hoss. She was married to Dan, the man who would come home exhausted, scoop up the kids, and still find energy to make them feel safe. The man who didn't just provide money or fame, but presence. And now that presence was gone. For the children, it was a strange kind of tragedy because it happened while the world still had their father on television. Imagine being a kid, knowing your dad is dead, while millions of strangers are still watching him smile, still laughing at his jokes, still calling him Hoss like he's alive. That kind of grief twists in the chest. It creates a silence you don't know how to speak. Each of Dan's sons and daughters processed the loss in different ways. Some leaned into privacy, some leaned into work, some leaned into art. But one thing stayed consistent. The Blocker children didn't use their father's name as a ladder. They didn't sell interviews every year. They didn't turn his death into a career. They protected him. They protected their mother. And maybe, in some ways, they protected themselves because there was a pressure attached to being Dan Blocker's child that most people will never understand. Fans didn't just love him, they felt like they owned a piece of him, like his story belonged to them. So even decades later, when the world would bring up Dan Blocker, it was rarely as a full human being. It was usually as Hoss, the gentle giant frozen in time, a character who never aged, never got sick, never struggled. But real life isn't kind enough to preserve people that way. Dan Blocker's children grew up hearing rumors, hearing myths, hearing strangers confidently repeating stories that weren't true. People would approach them with wide eyes and say things like, "Is it true he was buried in a piano box?" Or, "Is it true he," followed by some dramatic, exaggerated claim. And the family learned something quickly. If you correct every lie, you'll spend your entire life chasing smoke. So for a long time, they stayed quiet. They lived their lives. They built careers. They raised their own families. They tried to let the world have its memories while keeping the real Dan Blocker safe inside their hearts. But even if they stayed quiet publicly, Dan's presence never truly left the family. His influence showed up in the choices his children made, in the way they treated people, in the way they carried themselves, in the way they tried to be strong without becoming cruel, gentle without becoming weak. Dan had been that kind of man. And then something unexpected happened. As the years passed, fans didn't forget him. In fact, it almost felt like the love grew stronger with time. Bonanza reruns introduced Hoss to new generations. People who weren't even alive when Dan died began to fall in love with his character like it was a fresh discovery. And that, a steady wave of affection, kept pulling the Blocker family back into the orbit of his legacy. Eventually, Dan Blocker's sons stepped into the public eye in small ways, carefully, respectfully, not as celebrities begging for attention, but as sons preserving their father's memory. One son, Dirk Blocker, became an actor, but he didn't try to imitate his father's exact path. He built his own career. He carried the Blocker name, but he didn't weaponize it. Another son, David Blocker, became a film producer and worked on projects of his own. They weren't living in Dan's shadow. They were living beside his memory. And yet, even with all that respect and privacy, there remained a huge question fans couldn't stop asking. What was Dan really like at home? Not the Hoss version, not the TV legend, the real man. Was he truly as gentle as he appeared? Was he secretly troubled? Did fame change him? Did the war haunt him? Did the pressure of Bonanza wear him down? Was there something the public never knew? These questions hung in the air for years because the family didn't feed the machine. They didn't give the audience what it wanted. They chose dignity until now. Because what changed everything wasn't gossip. It wasn't a tabloid leak. It was one of Dan Blocker's sons reaching an age where he no longer felt the need to protect himself from the world's curiosity. At 66 years old, he finally spoke in a way that carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was calm, measured, and deeply personal. He confirmed what many fans had suspected and cleared up what so many people had gotten wrong. And the most powerful part was this. He didn't speak like a fan. He spoke like a son who still missed his father. And that's where the story becomes something more than nostalgia. Because when a child finally speaks about a parent who died too young, you're not just hearing facts. You're hearing the emotional truth behind the facts. And the truth he revealed was not the kind that makes you gasp for scandal. It's the kind that makes you go quiet, because it reminds you that behind every legend is a family who had to keep living after the credits rolled. Here's the part most people don't think about when they talk about a legend. A legend is easy to love from a distance. You watch the reruns, you smile, you remember the good feelings. You imagine that person lived inside that glow forever. But for Dan Blocker's son, Dirk Blocker, that glow came with a shadow. Because being the son of the man who played Hoss Cartwright wasn't just something you mentioned at school. It wasn't just a fun fact. It was a weight that followed him everywhere, even when he didn't ask for it. It was an identity people tried to hand him before they even knew who he really was. Dirk grew up watching something that still feels unreal. He watched his father walk into public places and instantly become surrounded. Fans calling out Hoss like they were greeting a family member, people rushing in for autographs, grabbing a moment, grabbing a memory. And as a child, you don't understand fame the way adults do. You just feel the chaos of it. You feel how it steals normal life, one interaction at a time. And that's why what Dirk finally expressed later hit so hard, because his message wasn't about building hype. It wasn't about turning his father into a bigger myth. It was about separating the man from the character and letting the world see the truth. Dirk made it clear that for him, his father wasn't Hoss. That was the role, the job, the image. The real Dan Blocker, the man at home, was defined by something deeper, by kindness that didn't turn off when the camera stopped, by humor that wasn't written into a script, but lived in everyday moments, by humility even after becoming famous, by values that didn't bend just because fame tried to push them. And Dirk's silence for so many years suddenly made more sense when you really sit with it. Because how do you speak about a father the world thinks it already knows? How do you correct myths without sounding bitter? How do you grieve someone privately when the public keeps pulling you back into the story? So Dirk built his own path carefully. He didn't chase the spotlight the way people expected. He didn't try to become a louder, bigger version of his father. Instead, he found peace in blending in focusing on the craft, in becoming the kind of actor who could disappear into a role instead of carrying a famous name like a neon sign. And that choice says everything, because it wasn't rejection, it was survival. Then the moment that shattered everything arrived. May 13th, 1972. Dan Blocker died, and the news didn't just travel through Hollywood. It traveled through homes, through generations, through the hearts of people who felt like they had lost something safe. But for Dirk, it wasn't a headline. It was his father. It was the man he leaned on, the rock, the role model, the center. The loss didn't just leave pain, it left silence. A deep kind of silence that settles into a family and changes the shape of their lives forever. And for a long time, that silence stayed. But over time, something began to shift inside Dirk. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into reflection, into gratitude, into a clearer understanding of who his father really was, not as a TV icon, but as a human being. And when Dirk finally spoke, the message that rose to the surface was simple but powerful. Dan Blocker lived with laughter. Dan Blocker carried humility. Dan Blocker held on to unshakable values, but not because it looked good on camera, but because that's who he was. That's what made him more than a Hollywood face. That's what made him unforgettable. And maybe that's the real reason fans still feel emotional when they see Hoss on screen. Because somewhere beneath the dialogue and the cowboy hat, people can sense it. That warmth wasn't fake. That heart wasn't acting. It was Dan. And today, the legacy doesn't only live in reruns, it lives in the quiet strength of the son who carries his father's story forward, not with noise, not with scandal, but with truth. The truth is undeniable. Bonanza without Dan Blocker was never quite the same. The show kept moving forward, the Ponderosa still standing, the Cartwright name still on screen, but something essential was missing. Not a storyline, not a character slot that could be filled, something warmer and deeper than that. Because Hoss Cartwright wasn't just muscle and jokes. He was the heart that softened the whole world of Bonanza. And when that heart disappeared, the audience felt it. Even the decisions around the show seemed to reflect that struggle. The network eventually moved Bonanza away from its long-standing Sunday night primetime home, shifting it to Tuesday nights. And for a series that had once felt like an American tradition, that move was more than scheduling. It was a sign that the era was changing and that the magic the show once held so naturally was becoming harder to protect. But here's the strange, beautiful part. Time didn't erase Dan Blocker. If anything, it preserved him, because Bonanza never truly went away. It became a classic, a still watched, still quoted, still loved. New generations discovered Hoss Cartwright the same way older fans did, and they felt the same warmth rise in their chest, like the world was briefly safer when he was on the screen. And that's why Dirk Blocker finally speaking matters so much. Not because it created scandal, not because it exposed some shocking hidden secret that changes everything, but because it gave the story a human ending. It reminded people that behind the legend was a father, a husband, a man who faced life with laughter, humility, and unshakable values. A man whose strength wasn't just in his size, but in his spirit. Dirk grew up in the shadow of that legend, watching his father get surrounded everywhere he went. Fans calling out Hoss with excitement, people reaching for a memory, a moment, a piece of someone they felt they loved. And as he got older, Dirk didn't chase the same kind of spotlight. What mattered more to him was the craft, the art of storytelling, becoming the kind of character actor who could blend into roles and live quietly inside the work. And still, even after decades, the loss remained personal, because May 13th, 1972 wasn't just a date in TV history. It was the day a son lost his father, the day a family lost its sender, the day the world lost a man who made kindness look powerful. Over time, that pain didn't disappear. It transformed into reflection, into a clearer understanding of what Dan Blocker really stood for. And in that understanding, Dirk's voice became something rare, a legacy carried forward without noise, without ego, just truth. So when people say Dan Blocker is gone, it's not entirely accurate. Because as long as Bonanza is still watched, as long as someone smiles when Hoss walks into a room, as long as fans remember the feeling he gave them, Dan's spirit still rides strong, just like Hoss. Forever part of the Bonanza legacy.